The three movements of an airplane. Now, an airplane has many movements, but when you hear someone talk about the three movements of an airplane, they are most likely referring to pitch, roll, and yaw. Every time you see a plane perform a maneuver or just carry out simple turns or climbs, one of these three motions is being practiced. These three movements move around three different axes, so before we discuss what these movements are, let's establish what these axes are. There's the lateral axis, which extends laterally or horizontally and goes from wingtip to wingtip. There's the longitudinal axis, think long. This extends from the tail of the plane all the way up to the nose. And then there's the vertical axis, think up and down. And this extends from the bottom of the plane where the landing gear is up to the top of the plane. Alright, now we know what our axes are, and I know you're just dying to know more about these three movements, so let's get right into them. First, we'll talk about pitch. So think about the last commercial flight you were on, if you've ever been on one. I usually fly Southwest or American. If you fly Spirit, don't even bother subscribing, you're not welcome here. But anyway, you made it through security without having to take your shoes off this time. You found your gate, at which point your dad was finally starting to relax, and then made it on the plane and awaited takeoff. Finally, the plane speeds down the runway and you feel that weird sensation in your stomach as the plane is going up. That's pitch. Pitch is any upward or downward movement of the airplane's nose. Upon takeoff, the pilot pitches the nose of the plane up by putting back pressure on the yoke or pulling it back. You'll have a better understanding of the mechanics of the plane that allow this movement as well as the other two to happen once we go over the control surfaces of an airplane. But for now, just know that pitch is the movement around the lateral axis, again, that's from wingtip to wingtip, and is the upward or downward rotation of an airplane, as you can see here. Pitch is the most noticeable in takeoffs, climbs, and descents. Another thing to note about pitch is that pitch affects the airplane's airspeed. The more you pitch the nose down, the faster the plane is going to go, and vice versa. The more you pitch the plane up, the less airspeed you are going to have. Alright, let's talk about roll. Once again, think back to your Southwest Airlines flight. Shortly after takeoff, you probably remember your stomach finally recovering from that weird feeling during the climb when you start feeling weird again, but this time it's because you look out the window and see that the wing is pointing toward the ground and you notice the plane feels like it's sideways. This is roll. Roll is the movement of a bank or a turn that the plane makes. In other words, it is the tilting of the plane's wings. When a pilot turns left, they roll the aircraft left by lowering the left wing. When they want to roll the aircraft to the right, they lower the right wing. Roll is the movement of the plane about the longitudinal axis, which again extends from the tail to the nose. Think about it like a long rod going right down the center of the plane, and the plane rotates about this rod. This is the movement of roll. Now, how much the pilot lowers the wing for a roll is important. It is definitely possible to bank too much or too little, though too much is more consequential. This is where the angle of bank will come in, which is basically how steep or shallow your turns are. Alright, finally, yaw. Now this is one of those homonyms. It's how your local Kardashian says the word yeah, but it also refers to the left and right horizontal rotations of an airplane. You're not necessarily going to feel this movement in the example of our commercial flight like you will the other two, but yaw is a left or right rotation of an airplane's nose. It is the movement about the vertical axis, which goes from the bottom of the plane, what I call the belly, to the top. Picture a vertical rod going down the middle of the plane. The plane rotates like twisting on a vertical pole. Now don't get confused. While both roll and yaw are rotations of the airplane's nose, they're not the same directions of rotation. Roll is a circular rotation, while yaw is more of a lateral rotation. Yaw is controlled by the rudder, which sits on the tail of the plane, and the rudder is controlled by the rudder pedals, which are on the floor of the cockpit, like the gas and brake pedals in a car. The pilot steps on these pedals in correlation with the direction he wants the rudder to pivot, and therefore which way he wants the plane to yaw. When both taxiing the plane on the ground and flying through the air, the plane doesn't always want to stay straight. Crosswinds and other factors can cause the plane to rotate laterally to the left or to the right. Using the rudder to yaw the plane in the opposite direction of the wind can help correct the plane's path and keep the nose straight. On the ground, the rudder pedals help you keep the plane nice and straight on the runways or taxiways. Alright, so a nice short video today, but just to review, the three axes of an airplane are the lateral axis, which goes from wingtip to wingtip, the longitudinal axis, which extends from the tail to the nose, and the vertical axis, which extends from the bottom of the plane to the top of the plane. The three movements of an airplane are pitch, roll, and yaw. Pitch is any upward or downward movement of the plane's nose. It moves about the lateral axis and affects the plane's airspeed. Roll is the circular rotation of a plane used in banks or turns. It moves about the longitudinal axis and is controlled by raising or lowering one wing of the plane. Yaw is the lateral rotation of an airplane's nose. It moves about the vertical axis and is controlled by the rudder pedals to combat wind and other forces to ensure straight flight. Now, in upcoming videos, we'll be talking more about the anatomy of an airplane, including the control surfaces as well as aerodynamics. These will help you have a better understanding of how these three movements are carried out and what they affect. Until then, get a good grasp on what we talked about today, and I'll see you in the next one.